There's a troubling theme running through American culture right now. Adults walking away from the very things that once defined what it meant to be fully human: marriage, children, family. There's a growing movement of young adults who've cut off contact with their own parents over ideology. What's happening to us? To help us make sense of this all, I'm joined by author and fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, Noelle Mering. Noelle, thank you for being here. New York Magazine ran a piece this month, and it was first-person accounts from young mothers who described regretting having their children. One of them, a 34-year-old, says, I'm going to read directly from this, "Thinking about life without them, I'd be happier overall," end quote. Another says she wished she'd lived alone in an isolated life, but a peaceful one. Noelle, what do you make of this? What's happening, and is this reflective of reality, or is it the New York Magazine trying to create one?
Both, unfortunately. I mean, I think we've gone from childless by choice, brunch and travel as the new aspirational lifestyle, to child regret. And this new movement is a little starker because there's children already involved, and the horrifying prospect of them actually hearing that their moms regretted having them, or even just sensing it in the way that they're being raised. So it's a darker turn, but I think in some ways it's a predictable one. Let me explain why. There's a few stages of progression when we are destabilizing a norm. The first stage, you destigmatize the deviation from the norm. You say, we're going to be childless. We decided we don't want children, and don't call us selfish. This is just our choice. Secondly, you normalize that deviation. So it just becomes entirely optional. You can get married and then you can choose to have children. You can choose to actively prevent children forever. It's just entire option to you, up to you. And there's not really a norm involved. And then thirdly, inversion. The norm itself becomes cast as a source of oppression, sort of a darker choice, something that hinders your freedom and liberty. And then the rejection of it becomes an act of courage, an act of liberation. Now, it's interesting because in some ways I read this article with some sympathy. Parenting is incredibly difficult. And I think we can acknowledge that as we're a more mobile society, we have less of a safety network. We don't have parents and oftentimes grandparents, cousins, and aunts and uncles to help us. It's also incredibly hard for anyone, but it's incredibly made much more difficult if we no longer see it as a social good, a necessity. That if we start seeing it as being something that is sort of devalued in our minds, it becomes very difficult to endure the sacrificial acts that are required by parenting when you don't see the why behind it. It's not that we don't know how to suffer, it's just that we've chosen to suffer for other things.
Yeah, and Noelle, these aren't women in this New York Magazine piece. These women don't, it's not that they don't love their children, they say they do, but there's a real disconnect between loving someone and experiencing their existence as a burden. What does that tell us about how our culture has sold young women the idea of motherhood?
Yeah, no, it's incredible. I mean, I think that it is so recast motherhood as being something that's deeply antagonistic to their well-being and their flourishing. It's really the exact opposite of what motherhood is. And so they're given sort of things to be attracted to in life, such as a high-end career that they're willing to suffer for, or even beauty. We see plastic surgery and also, intense exercise regimes that women are willing to endure for. And they're not putting that endurance into the family life. And I think there's a real spiritual nihilism underlying this. So one of the things I hear a lot in researching my next book, the No Contact Movement, is adult children saying, I didn't consent to be born. You chose to have me, so you owe me, I don't owe you. And the underlying message there is that my life is not a blessing, it's a burden. And so if the act of parenting is no longer generous, you're not giving something good to this person, you're actually burdening them with their own life, then why would anyone move into that category of parenthood? So there's a real connection to the birth dearth here.
Yeah. Well, look, as somebody who's on the far side of this with grown kids, I can't fathom any of this. I mean, I would argue for men and women, marriage and children reveal your purpose. I mean, it's in them that I certainly discovered my reason for being. My wife sacrificed her career for our kids, but they're all healthy, they're happy, they're productive people due to that sacrifice, frankly. And I don't see how there could be anything more precious or valuable. I mean, the car's going to rot, the career's going to go away, your looks are going to age. Your children, your family, that goes on and on.
That's right. It's really hard to unwire this kind of desire and this intuitive need to love the child in front of us, to want to be fruitful, to want to be in unity with our family, to get women to be convinced to walk away from all of that, either by never entering into it or by abandoning it altogether. It takes a whole host of sort of propaganda and coercion and manipulation. Unfortunately, we've had that for decades. They've been very patient. The ideologues have been seeding revolutionary mindset into all of us. And I think we should be just as confident that we have truths about human nature and we can seed the real vision of what a good life is and the real flourishing of the human person in order to kind of dismantle this kind of mountain of ideology that has been thrust upon us.
You wrote a recent piece, which I want to explore later, where you write, a purely comfortable life is eventually perceived as a meaningless one. Now, it strikes me that these young women are experiencing the inverse, a deeply uncomfortable life that also feels meaningless. So where does meaning break down, Noelle? And is there something the church can say to a woman currently in that place?
Yeah, I think, it's complicated because oftentimes, there are real wounds underlying the way that someone is disposed to accept ideology is because they are wounded. And what the ideology steps in to do is to help them double down on that wound and to give an explanatory cause for it and sort of a culprit. And we've also at the same time incentivized us to find our virtue in our victimhood. And I think that's a deeply toxic way to build a culture. Why? Because in order to maintain a status of victimhood, I have to maintain a position of accusation. I have to always have a perpetrator. And so I think we've kind of jumped on sort of real wounds in society and then encouraged people to kind of rub raw the sores of discontent with anger, with discontent, with rage. And that serves well sort of an ideology that wants to break things down and blow things up. It doesn't serve well to get people to move to a place of real deep meaning where they can aspire to a life that is going to be rich and really in line with our human nature. So I think the church really is at the perfect position to kind of offer exactly what are the deepest longings in our hearts and souls. We have to speak about it unapologetically, but with a lot of great love, and sort of show the way towards beauty, show the way towards the good life through elevating stories of heroic people, not just trying to criticize, the wrongs in this world, but elevating the beautiful ways in which we can live. I think the church is properly positioned to do that. And it seems like there's a real hunger out there. We're seeing a lot of people seeking meaning, seeking authority, seeking something that takes them out of sort of the mundane, prosaic world that we live in, wanting that transcendence. And so how much more we can lean into that and really encourage, deepen, and direct what's happening in people, I think is going to be for our benefit and for the culture's benefit.
Another disturbing trend that we're seeing, Noelle, recently is one you've also written about in The Federalist. It's called Cutting Off Your Parents is Identity Politics, Not Boundaries. And you argue there that the no-contact movement follows the same grammar as identity politics. Virtue signaling, victim classes, moral absolutism, an adversarial caste in every relationship. Where did this come from? This idea that you could just cut people off?
Well, in some ways, it seems like it's the logic of a very online generation applied to their real life relationships, where they're used to curating their reality. When things get hard, you can mute someone, you can block someone, you can unfollow someone. Well, you're applying that ethic into your real relationships, and that does not translate well for anyone, people on either side of either being cut off or the one doing the cutting off. So I think it's the newest manifestation of attacking the family unit. And I do think, the way that it's talked about in these subcultures of the no contact movement, it really mirrors identity politics. So it will say there's a group that's in the power position, and that's the parents. They've got the power. And then there's the group that, didn't consent to their life, didn't consent to their birth, and they are in the victim position. And so the duty flows one way. It flows from the parents to the child, and the child owes nothing, even in adulthood, owes no allegiance or honor to the parents. It's, of course, an inversion of the fourth commandment. And one of the saddest parts about it is that it's leaving a lot of young adults very vulnerable to sort of the inevitable crises of their life. They don't have that family support. One of the things that they're doing to step in and to kind of put a Band-Aid over is that they've erected this idea of the chosen family, that the family that I choose is born of my autonomy. Now, that can be a beautiful thing. Sometimes we need our friends to become like family. But when we're using it to replace the family, that's not a very stable way of moving through the world. And oftentimes what they find is that the family that they choose can just as easily unchoose them. And so they're being abandoned again after already abandoning the families of their origin. So this is a real crisis, and we're seeing it being given more attention increasingly in mainstream press, and for good reason, because it is taking on a new tenor and a new escalation that we've not seen before.
Isn't there something almost totalitarian about this? I mean, the adult child who cuts off contact, they get to be judge and jury. The parent has no appeal, really. You write that the adult child cutting contact is always right and righteous. Where does that presumption come from, particularly when these are often the folks who talk about condemning moral absolutism, Noelle?
That's right. It really is an averted sort of its own authoritarianism. So that's rife throughout the movement. Is subcultures will say, you can never question adult child's decision to go no contact. It's sort of an infallibility narrative that they're given, and it really gives cover. It mirrors other things we've seen in the culture. For example, during the Me Too movement, when it was believe all women, as though, just purely by status of being a victim, you have empirical authority or epistemic authority. I think we all know in our personal lives it's just not true. Suffering can just as easily obscure reality as it can illuminate it. And so we all need to be checked. We all need to be corrected and course corrected and open to ways in which we might be able to see things differently. But there's a real tendency to black and white thinking here. My fact of my claiming harm is a validation of all my prudential decisions from here on out. That's just not a healthy way to look at any problem.
There's a sub-phenomena that I've been reading about. You call it the pissed off parent pushback, where these are mothers on TikTok calling their estranged children ungrateful little B words. Noelle, you say that response, however understandable, is also wrong. Why?
Okay, well, with identity politics, it always provokes a reaction. I think we're seeing this across all sorts of identitarian divides, where if one group claims sort of this authority and black and white thinking long enough, eventually the group that is being told to shut up and be quiet and be silenced is going to do it back to them and claim the victimhood status themselves. And so, yeah, there's a movement where parents are saying, talking derisively about their kids now, and they want to start their own movement, and they're angry, and I think it's understandable, but it's not effective, nor is it healthy. We always have to be non-reactionary. We need to look at things, strive to look at with reality, not born out of emotion, but out of self-governance of the way we respond to things. So I encourage parents to kind of look at it as truthfully as they can, but not be kind of ruled by their emotions, even if it is in some ways a justifiable and understandable emotion. That we cannot become the pissed off parents. That actually just creates another swing of the pendulum. We keep battling each other back and forth. Someone needs to step out of that cycle, and I do think it is becoming for parents as sort of their call to moral nobility and moral authority as shepherds to be the ones who take the higher road, not the weak road, but the higher road.
Well, I'm thinking of the prodigal son, that father. And it's hard to be that father after you've been beaten up or your kids have cut you off. But maybe we have to show that gratuitous love and hope that somehow breaks through. Particularly, everything we're talking about today is really about dividing the family, and the family is a battleground. And the fact that this stuff gets curry on social media and becomes a phenomenon is deeply disturbing, and I think has the mark of the satanic about it.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It very much is following sort of a diabolical sort of thinking. And I think that you're right, that we have to kind of see the nihilism that's underneath it and reject it entirely. I do think that this is ultimately a spiritual battle. There are natural ways that we can talk about this and talk to people who are not religious to help them see kind of the harm of it, to our civic life, but also to our religious life, and to our future unity. But ultimately, foundationally, as people of prayer, we need to be leading utterly in that realm, that we need to be seeing this for what it is, and not, like you said, the prodigal father, not being reactionary, not chasing after. He didn't chase after his son. He wasn't desperate. He tended to his duties, but he was open and ready to receive him and give that inheritance back to his son as soon as there was a turn. And so I think that posture, the prodigal father, is really the greatest model we have here. He wasn't calculating, nor was he passive, but he was waiting and he was prepared.
I want to turn to something a little more hopeful, Noelle, because I don't want to upset everybody, including myself. There's a wave of young adults coming into the Catholic Church, and in a piece entitled "What Young Converts Are Really Looking For," you open with something a young convert told you, that the difference between non-denominational churches and the Catholic Church was this. In one, the dads want to be young and cool, and in the other, the dads are striving to be men. Now, Noelle, I know there's a crisis of masculinity in the culture today. Is that what we're seeing driving the young people to tradition, particularly young men?
I really think that that's a piece of it, and a pretty compelling piece. And I think, the message that you are enough, affirm you where you are, that's not a message that ultimately is going to resonate in a very purposeful way, especially for men who really want to be challenged, who want to be drawn out of themselves. Women as well, that nobody really values something that they don't have to really struggle for in any way. And I think the faith is a bit like that, that we are called to be, that we have dignity just where we are, but we are also called, invited into, a road, a path of holiness, of virtue, that we are, not supposed to stay mired in our sin, but we are to struggle against our sin. And I think, the church has that message very deeply. And I was very struck by this young man who's very insightful. He said, that he had spent a long time in these non-denominational churches. And this is not to castigate all non-denominational churches. It was just his experience, but that there really was a sense that they were just cool guys. And what the Catholic men that he met, the ones that were really on fire in love with our Lord, they were eager to be the best fathers, to be the best leaders, to be the best husbands that they could possibly please. There's this real striving after holiness, and that appealed to him. And I think that is significant and appealing to a lot of young men in the country.
Noelle, thank you so much. We will leave it there. No Contact, How a Seductive Ideology Broke Families and Friendships by Noelle Mering will be released this September from Forum Books at Penguin Random House. Thank you for being here.